Anyways, welcome everybody to Sabor Latino, a presentation on Latin American repertoire for piano. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dario Martin. I teach music fundamentals and class piano and functional piano here at the University of Alaska. I'm originally from Cuba, so I grew up listening to this type of music. My dad especially a musician too, and he plays popular Cuban music too, so I learned a little bit of guitar and percussion with him when I was younger, but my main instrument is piano, really. Hi, welcome. So I also performed a lot of Cuban music when I was in Cuba. I came to the US about 11 years ago to continue my studies here. I did my master's and then my doctorate at Indiana University, and I recently moved to Alaska last year, so I'm excited to be here. To start a conversation about Latin American music, we first need to define what is Latin America as a region, because there are some misconceptions about what is Latin America. There are two different concepts. One is Hispanic and another thing is Latino, right? So Hispanic people are basically people who speak Spanish, and that does not necessarily mean that you're Latin American, because you could be Spanish from Spain. And then Latino people, in general, we call Latinos to the people who live in the continent of America, like the Latin American continent, and they speak Romance languages. That could be Spanish mostly, but also Portuguese, and to a smaller degree French or Creole in Haiti, for instance. When we talk about Latin American music, we're referring to the music composed by people of Latin origin. In that case, going from Mexico to the south, including Brazil, of course, because that would be a Portuguese-speaking country, but not including all countries in the Caribbean. So Jamaica would not be considered Latin America. So reggae is not really a Latin rhythm, for instance, because in Jamaica you speak English, not Spanish. And there are other islands in the Caribbean where you don't really speak Spanish or Portuguese, like Trinidad and Tobago, and they have a very big musical tradition as well, and that is not Latin either. So Calypso, for instance, which is a genre from Trinidad, would not necessarily be a Latin rhythm. That is kind of the concept of Latin America, in case you were not super sure about it. And there are several musicologists, in this case Gerard Pejac, which is one of the major scholars of Latin America, of Latin American topics in music, and he said that the region is just too vast and diverse to be interpreted as a cohesive musical region. So it's kind of difficult to really put together all of the different genres and styles in Latin America in a single unit. It's kind of very diverse, right? But anyways, we'll try here to cover as much as we can. And then there's also the discussion about collective identity versus national identity, because of course it's very different, the music from Argentina compared to the music of the Caribbean, for instance. And that is related also to the ethnic, the different ethnic groups that settled in that region. There are countries like Cuba or Brazil where we had a very strong slave trade, and that brought a lot of Africans. So for that reason, we have a much larger population of African origin compared to the extreme south of America, like Argentina or Chile, where they didn't have a very big slave trade. And then in other regions of Latin America, you have very strong identities related to native populations, like Native Americans, Native Latin Americans. That's the case of Central America in countries like Mexico, also Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala. You have very strong indigenous cultures, as opposed to Cuba, for instance, where actually our natives were completely decimated by the Spanish when they came. So we only have either European origin, people from European origin, or from Africa, but not really native indigenous in Cuba, for instance. So, and then one of the things that brings us together as a region, I guess, would be the language, of course, because we all speak, well, most of us speak Spanish, and that would be our common language and our common culture. And to a smaller extent, Portuguese, that would be only in Brazil, really. But Portuguese and Spanish are quite close, as you may know. Then we have the religion, which is mostly Catholic in the Latin American region, although we have other minorities that we'll mention, of course. As I already mentioned, we have a multi-ethnic population, mostly African and European in the Caribbean, and then indigenous in some areas of Central America, and South America, and then we have a common history of colonization by the Spanish. We had the history of slavery, unfortunately, and then the independence wars that started at the beginning of the 19th century and ended near the end of the 19th century, really, with the last two colonies, Cuba and Puerto Rico. So that would be just an overview of what makes us similar. But then what makes us different? Well, we have indigenous languages in different regions, of course, dialects. We have Creole in Haiti, as I mentioned before, which is related to French and not really Spanish or Portuguese. And then we have, of course, different variants of Spanish, and sometimes it's kind of tricky to understand each other when we speak our slang from our own countries, right? So yeah, it is the same language, but it's sort of like the same difference of British English and Jamaican English. You know, it's the same language, but not quite the same accent. We have, besides the Catholic religion, which is the major, like the biggest religion in the region, we have religions of African origins, like Yoruba, Bantu, and Abakwa. Those are the main roots, and they come from different regions of Africa, depending on where the slaves were sent from. And that leads into two very large, I would say, in the first case would be the Afro-Caribbean religion of Santeria, and in the second case would be Candomblé in Brazil, which is an Afro-Brazilian religion. So it's really a mix of African religion with Catholic religion, which is kind of cool. And then of course we have indigenous religions, and the specific national identities of every country in Latin America. So that all of this means that the music in Latin America is really, really diverse. It's very rich. We have influences from European cultures, of course, but we also have native traditions that developed in different countries depending on the degree to which we had indigenous populations or African or descendants of African slaves brought to America, right? In the case of the European elements in Latin American music, we can cite things like form. So the structure of the music in general follows certain patterns from European traditions like binary form, rondo form, etc. And the influence from Romanticism and Modernism in the 20th century. Then we have African elements such as rhythmic patterns, syncopation, a lot of syncopation, but also pentatonic melodies, and that is something that we all know happened also here in Africa, also in African American music, right? And also some instruments, like the drums from African native cultures that were sort of a little bit transformed into the Caribbean, but it's still sort of the same source. We also have indigenous elements in different countries of Latin America, depending on the level of, the level of the amount of indigenous populations in those countries. So we have some textures, rhythms, the invitation of nature, which we will see in Brazilian music, especially in the works of Villa-Lobos. And also we have indigenous instruments. So going back to the 19th century, some of the characteristics that we find in Latin American music are basically, the romantic style that was coming from Europe, of course, that was pretty prominent in Latin America as well. But there's also a sense of nationalism, and this is related to the fact that the independence wars actually began in Latin America in the 19th century, around 1810, 1820s, and then later on in some Caribbean countries. So I will start just showing you guys the first examples, the first musical examples of this. And those are salon dances that some Cuban composers wrote for piano. The contradanza and habanera are some of the rhythms and the genres that they worked with. And the choro is something that developed in Brazil, actually, not in Cuba. So the first two genres will be from Cuba, and the choro from Brazil. This Manuel Salomel and Ignacio Cervantes. Oh, sorry, this is a miss. It's Ignacio, no N there. Sorry. So Ignacio Cervantes, they are the most important Cuban composers in the 19th century. And then Chiquinha Gonzaga, it's a female composer in Brazil that has a very fascinating story. So I hope I can get to talk a little bit more about her. So let's just start with a little bit of Cervantes. And he is perhaps the most important, really the most important Cuban composer in the 19th century. He was a very accomplished pianist, and he studied in Paris at the Paris Conservatoire. He actually won the piano competition, which is a very big deal. So he was really on the top of his field in Paris. Then he went back to Cuba, and in 1870, and started teaching piano and performing a lot. He married a pianist as well. But then, so back then in Cuba was still part of Spain, right? Because Cuba became independent in 1902, actually, so in the 20th century. Cuba and Puerto Rico were the last two colonies of Spain in the Caribbean. So back in the day, there was a movement in favor of Cuban independence, and he was, of course, in favor of that. So not only his music reflects that interest in developing a national style, but also he actually contributed physically. Like he actually gathered money and donated money just for the cause of the Cuban independence, which got him into trouble, as you can imagine, with the authorities of Spain. So he was actually accused of conspiracy, and he was expelled from the country. So he came to New York, and that's when he composed one of his most famous dances for piano, which is called Farewell to Adios a Cuba, which means farewell to Cuba. And it's kind of a sad story because when he was traveling from Cuba to New York, his wife was pregnant and she lost the baby on the it was like very traumatic for them as a family. So I think they were given like 24 hours to leave the country. So yeah, that happened, and it's a very sad piece for piano. Then a few years after, he was able to return to Cuba, and he composed Return Home. That's Vuelta al Hogar. That's another dance for piano. He later died in 1905, and then one of his daughters, Maria Cervantes, who is also a composer and a pianist, she finished one of his unfinished dances for piano, and she titled the dance Fusión de Almas, which means fusion of souls, I guess, would be a translation for that. It's a very beautiful dance. So I will play just two examples of his dances for piano. He wrote 40 of these dances. They are pretty good for pedagogical purposes because they're very short. They're like 1 minute. It's like literally 1 page per dance. It's not that easy though. It's harder than it looks, although it's very short, that's for sure. And the reason why these dances were short is that they were supposed to be danced. They were actually danced, like literally you could dance to the music. And this is related to the contradanza genre. So it's kind of the same thing. Contradanza and danza, they are interchangeable in the Cuban music. So they have binary form, A-B, and they have rhythmic patterns of habanera. The rhythmic pattern of habanera is the bum, 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 bum. That's the rhythmic pattern of habanera. By the way, it's pronounced habanera. I know that here in the US sometimes we call it habanera, but we don't pronounce the H. It's silent in Spanish. So it's habanera because the city is Havana. It's Havana in Spanish, actually. So habanera comes from the city, Havana, right? So, and they have humorous themes. So they have titles, and they're quite funny sometimes. Sometimes they're descriptive titles. So, Oh yeah, so these are the patterns. The melody sometimes has that syncopated rhythm, pa-pum, pa-pum, pum, pa-pum. That's pretty common. And then the bass line is sort of the habanera rhythm, but as you can see, we have a tie here. So sometimes you do play it like habanera, pum, pa-pum, pum. Sometimes you just do pum, pum. Yeah. So you like it, right? No, let's just try it. So let's just clap the melody. Ready, go. Good, good. And let's clap the bass line with no tie first. No tie. Ready, go. Now let's do the tie. Ready, go. Yeah, guys, I think about it, right? So let's see if there's anything else I wanted to. Yeah, so this is the first one example I will play for you guys. This is titled Los Tres Golpes, which means that's the three strikes. That's the translation. And I'm not quite sure why he titled that the three strikes, but there are three notes. Like throughout the whole thing, there are always three notes that are kind of important, like 1, 2, 3. It's very fun music. So that would be one example, and then there's another one which is really funny. It's called El Velorio, which means the funeral, but it's very funny because sometimes he composed things based on things that he, like gossips that he heard on the streets or something like that. So apparently the history of this song is this piece is that he heard this. It's like really blurry and it's in Spanish, but basically this is something that he heard on the streets. It's a conversation between two people, and it's saying, poor Juan, poor John, he has died leaving his family in misery. What a good boy, he was so honest. And then the other person says, no way, he was like, when he used to, like, that was the place, this place is La Chorrera, so when he used to go to that fun place, he would eat like crazy and gather with all these people, so probably like not great people. And then the other person says, oh yeah, but you know, don't talk bad about him, he just died. So basically, you know, the characters saying that, you know, the first character, which is like the same person, that's like the sad part of the song, of the piece, right? And then you have this person making fun of him in the middle, right? And you can actually kind of hear that in the dance. So let me play it for you. So yeah, here's the funeral. So yeah, we have 40 of these, which are like really cool pieces. And the one interesting thing is that the last three are for four hands, are actually not for solo piano, and they are actually easier because they are four hands, right? So those are definitely doable for younger pianists if you're a music teacher. Like in Cuba, we all play them. It's like super famous. I mean, for us, it's like all piano students play the four-hand dances. So yeah, that would be a really good choice if you wanna, spice things up. So moving on, the next composer that I want to mention, would be Chiquinha Gonzaga. She is a Brazilian female composer from the late 19th century, and she lived a little bit of the 20th century. She is really important for Brazilian music, not only because of what she did as a musician, but also her story is quite fascinating. Actually, there's actually a soap opera in Brazil that is quite famous about her life. So yeah, she's sort of compared to Clara Schumann. For those of you who know Clara Schumann, Clara Schumann was married to Robert Schumann, and she was also a very excellent pianist. And also a conductor, which is not very common in the 19th century, because normally that was a job only for men in the 19th century. So Clara Schumann kind of made a statement by conducting an orchestra as a woman. Chiquinha Gonzaga did the same thing in Brazil. She was the first female conductor in Brazil. She is also the creator of carnival music and the genre choro, which is a popular genre in Brazilian music. And then at the age of 16, she was also another common point between her and Clara Schumann is that they had very strong fathers, right? For those of you who know Clara Schumann, you know that her father was not very happy that she was getting married to Robert Schumann, and he was very against that marriage. Well, in this case, it was different, but basically her father forced her to get married to a Navy official at the age of 16. So she did not want to get married to that person, but she had to do it. Shortly after, she was pregnant, so she had 3 children actually with that first husband. But then she divorced, which was a very big scandal, because that's another thing that was very uncommon in Brazil, in Brazilian society in the 19th century, for a woman to really ask for divorce. That was really not normal, right? So because of that, she suffered social ostracism. And then she also had a legal battle for the custody of her children. Actually, from the 3 children, she only was able to keep 1, and then the officer kept 2 of her children. There's a late story which is kind of very controversial too. At the age of 52, she began a secret relationship with a 16-year-old student, and actually they had to move to Portugal because that was also very, as you can imagine, a scandal. So they went to Portugal, and she ended up adopting the student as a son. And then after a few years, they came back to Brazil, and I guess by that time he was not underage anymore. But yeah, it's kind of controversial, right? She's very important also because she was a very strong activist against slavery. And actually, she was not white Brazilian. She was mixed race. So she suffered also from discrimination, racial discrimination in Brazil. So she composed a lot of music for piano. Actually, she was a very good pianist. And in this case, I don't play her pieces, so I'm going to just show you the choro, which is the genre that I mentioned a few times already. And this is one of her. Oh, sorry.
Your slides stop right now. What you're about to hear in this video may prevent serious health issues in the future.
All right. that would be one example of a choro. By the way, this genre is not only performed by piano, by solo piano. The typical, well, I mean, there's no typical, but I guess it's also very common to see choros performed by guitars with flutes. They're like small ensembles that they're called chorões in Portuguese. So those are the ensembles that perform that genre. And then the other one is just the first. So the story of this piece is kind of interesting because there was no carnival march before this piece. This was like the first carnival march ever invented in Brazil. And as you probably know that the carnival in Rio de Janeiro is like one of the biggest in the world. So it's kind of a big deal that she created this, the carnival march, which we still use today. I mean, not we, but they. They still perform in the carnival in Rio de Janeiro. So apparently the story is that they used to play just like European music in the opening of the carnival, and then one day she was like, why don't we create just like Brazilian music? It makes more sense just for the march. So she created this is the first carnival march, and she just did it for piano, but then there are many arrangements for different ensembles. Oh, sorry, let's just go back there.
It's on the screen.
Oh, here?
Yeah.
Oh. As you can see, it's. I mean, this is from 1899. So I guess what we know today as Brazilian popular music was still developing. So it's kind of, the first attempt to create a typical carnival music, which later on became samba, and all of that happened in the 20th century. So then moving on. Hold on, where are we? I'm trying to figure out here. Okay. All right. Then we get into the 20th century, and in the 20th century, what happened in Latin America is that we have this confluence of modernism coming from Europe. So all those genres and sonorities of the avant-garde, and then on the other hand, we have nationalism, which becomes really, really strong in the 20th century. And actually we have another quote from Behar. So he's saying that lacking a usable tradition in their own immediate past, many of the composers in Latin America had to face the 20th century head-on rather than follow a gradual and slow development. In the most successful works, composers did not merely imitate new European styles, but attempted to assimilate them. And that's what happened with the three composers that I will talk about. Ernesto Lecuona in Cuba, Heitor Villa-Lobos in Brazil, and Alberto Ginastera in Argentina. Those are very, very important composers for the continent in general, and they also wrote a lot of music for piano, so it's kind of cool that as pianists we get to play their music. So I will start with Lecuona, I believe. Yes. So Lecuona, he's perhaps the most famous composer in Cuba in the first half of the 20th century. He composed a lot of pieces for piano and also a lot of songs for voice and piano. Some of his songs are actually quite famous, at least in Latin America. He studied piano with his sisters. Then he went to the conservatory in Havana. He graduated from there. Then he had a very successful international career as a pianist. So he traveled to New York, Paris, but also Latin America. He actually was a Grammy nominee in 1942, not as a pianist, but as a composer. So, like, I think one of his songs was nominated to the Grammys. And he lost to White Christmas. That was, wow. He was competing against that, so can you imagine. He was a very prolific composer. He also wrote a lot of film music, and he kind of worked in Hollywood a little bit. He eventually emigrated to Tampa, to Florida in 1960, and died in Canary Islands, that's in Spain, in 1963. So in terms of the piano compositions, the piano repertoire that he wrote, we have a series of Cuban dances. They are definitely longer than the ones that we have seen before. So they're probably like 4 pages each, more or less. So it's significantly longer. He also wrote Spanish dances because his mother was from Spain, so he had that dual cultural background, I guess. So a lot of like Spanish, like it sounds like completely like Spanish, really, dances. And then he has the ones that I'm gonna talk about a little bit more, the Afro-Cuban dances. And those are the most interesting, really, because of the novelty. He composed the 6 Afro-Cuban dances. The first one is from 1912, and I think they were edited for the first time, the 6 of them, around 1920s, like sometime after 1920. So those 6 dances are based on Afro-Cuban rhythms. And their titles are kind of descriptive too. So La Comparsa is the carnival procession, so that's what is represented in the picture. Y la negra bailaba, which is the female black woman is dancing. Danza Lucumí, which refers to the Afro-Cuban religion of the Lucumis, that's a religion. Danza de los Ñáñigos, which is another Afro-Cuban religion. Black dance would be Danza Negra, and then La Conga de Medianoche is the carnival at midnight, pretty much, right? So another interesting feature of these compositions for piano is that not only they showcased the Afro-Cuban rhythms, but also they had a little bit of European avant-garde in them. So you can see some of those sonorities of the avant-garde together with the European, like the Afro-Cuban rhythms. And we will see that in the following example, I think. So this is the beginning of La Comparsa, which is the first one. He composed this with 17 years old, I think. So yeah, he was pretty young. Let me find it. And this is actually the shortest one. This is only 3 pages, so I'm gonna play just the whole thing. It's not very long. So the left hand has that accompanimental pattern. And that would be the sound, that would be the rhythmic pattern that the African drums normally play in some of the African chants, the Afro-Cuban chants. So, bum, 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 bum. So that would be the base of the rhythmic base of the piece. So. So yeah, that is his first Afro-Cuban dance, and it's the easiest one. So for students, it's perhaps the most accessible one. And here's the deal: the texture in Lecuona's music is not very thick. As you can see, it's just a melody with accompaniment. The rhythm, though, is a little tricky. It gets very syncopated. And then he was very famous for his ability with the octaves. For those of you who are not pianists, octaves are that interval. So he was very famous for being able to play like super fast octaves. Apparently, he had a very large hand. And the thing is, some of his dances are very, very challenging because of the octaves. He has like very pages of just quick octave passages. So it's kind of cool. But I wanted to show you another Afro-Cuban dance where you can actually see that modernist influence, and it's the one titled La Conga de Medianoche, so the Midnight Conga Carnival, and it's the one with polytonality. So it's kind of cool because as you may know, in the 20th century, European composers started to go away from traditional harmonies and tonality, and they started exploring with bitonality or polytonality. That means if you're writing for piano, you would have one hand in one key and the other hand in a different key. So that would be an example of polytonality. In this case, he writes the right hand is playing only white keys, the left hand is only playing black keys. So he's trying to get, I guess the idea behind it is getting that percussive sound, right? So it goes like this. Sorry. So you see, it's mostly about that rhythm, and then. So that was a little fragment of polytonality, but there's another one later on. It's here. Well, I guess I'll play the whole thing. But also there's another example of European influence, which would be the whole tone scale, which was very kind of famous within the Impressionist aesthetic. And it's the scale made out of only whole tones. So instead of a major or minor scale, minor, you would have only whole tones. And it's kind of dreamy, right? So yeah, he uses that scale here. So anyways, maybe I'll play a little bit of this. I didn't quite practice this one, so let's see, but it's kind of cool. I think it's very cool. So yeah, let's see. So yeah, there are 6 of those, and they are just inspired by Afro-Cuban rhythms, as you can see. So by the way, this is the one that I just played. That's the beginning. I always wonder why he wrote his signature here. It's kind of I don't know why, because it's really only black keys and white keys. So why is it in G major? I don't. Anyway, so but we move on to Brazil again, and then we will talk a little bit about Heitor Villa-Lobos. He's perhaps the most important Brazilian composer in the 20th century. Very interesting. His life was very interesting as well. He was described as a musical genius by Arthur Rubinstein, a very famous pianist in the 20th century. Considered the most important composer of modernism in Brazil. He also played all instruments basically. So he studied cello and guitar as a kid, and then he learned piano as well. At the beginning, he would play mostly popular music, like choros, the genre that we saw before, with the ensembles of guitars. So that's kind of how he got into popular music. But he also studied classical cello as well. So he loved Bach, and then we will see why he went back to Bach after his late years. He traveled a lot, and he went to the Amazon, the rainforest, just to do a little bit of ethnomusicological research. And there are a lot of myths about his trip to the Amazon forest. There's actually a movie about this. The life of Villa-Lobos is quite interesting. But anyways, he was like an adventurer, right? Back then, traveling to the Amazon was kind of wild because it's not like they had a lot of infrastructure to get there. So he just kind of almost died on that expedition by himself. But anyways, apparently he gathered some interesting research on native indigenous rhythms and music from that expedition. So his piano style evolved from romantic style in his early compositions into impressionist a little bit later on, and finally he developed his own style, the Brazilian modernism, which is kind of why we know him. And yeah, he really did a lot for Brazilian music. But then what happened is that he he had a nationalist agenda that really kind of clicked very well with a dictator in Brazil, and it was Getúlio Vargas. He was one of those Latin American dictators that we had in the 20th century, right? So, but the thing is, he was kind of in favor of getting a strong nationalist, he was a nationalist, the dictator I'm talking about, Getúlio Vargas. So he found that Villa-Lobos would be a very useful instrument for his policies, because he was trying to promote Brazilian nationalism in his country. So he kind of gave Villa-Lobos the power to promote Brazilian culture in general, which was good, definitely, right? So he became the director of the Superintendencia de Educação Musical y Artística, which means it's like the Ministry of Culture, basically. So yeah, he was in charge of that, and with that purpose, he created a lot of music, like hundreds of songs for choirs. So he has a lot of choral music. So he created cantos orfeónicos, which are very large choirs of even hundreds of students, where he promoted Brazilian music that he composed for. So it was kind of a good relationship, right? The politician got the promotion of the patriotic and nationalist agenda, and then he got promoted his own music through that program. Because that was in any public school, you would have to sing in those choirs that music, right? So that's how he became so famous in Brazil. He traveled to Paris in 1923. He got a travel grant, and I think he lived in Paris for 1 or 2 years. There he actually got to know a lot of very famous modernist composers in Paris. And he got influenced by them as well. So neoclassicism was actually pretty important in Europe back then. So when he came back to Brazil, he sort of started mixing or like trying to get a neoclassical style that was also Brazilian. And that's when we find one of his most iconic pieces or works, Baquianas Brasileiras. So Baquianas Brasileiras is not really a piano composition only, it's a series of compositions for different instruments. So we have one for piano, this is Baquiana Brasileira number 4, the one that I will talk about next. But he also has a Baquiana Brasileira that is very famous for cellos and one soprano. There's a single soprano, a solo soprano, and an ensemble of cellos. And he has for orchestra, he has for guitar, so every Baquiana Brasileira has its own instrumentation. And there's one for solo piano, that's the one that I will maybe play a little bit. And he has this quote, he said, Brazil spent, I think this is after he came back from Paris actually. He said, Brazil spent a long time, my friends, many years imitating, aping, parroting. But thanks God it looked for a mirror or found by chance the reflected reality of a great race, of a great nation. And thus realized that Brazilian people could never be themselves if they didn't try their own manner without imitating anyone. So again, he was trying to really promote nationalism in Brazil, in Brazilian music. And the Semana de Arte, so the Week of Modern Art of 1922 was just a very big event in Brazil, and that's where Villa-Lobos and other artists, not only musicians but also visual artists, and Mario Andrade, which is a very important musical critic in Brazil, got together in an attempt to create modernism, national modernism, right? But Brazilian modernism. So that's the avant-garde of Europe together with the national rhythms. So yeah, and then Baquianas Brasileiras would be a great example of neoclassical. Baquiana comes from Bach, from Johann Sebastian Bach. So Brazilian Bach is like what it is, right? So it's kind of a blend of, it would be like neo-Baroque really, because Bach is not a classical composer but a Baroque composer. But he got some of the textures of Bach, some of the sonorities that you would expect from the Baroque era, and he mixed that with Brazilian popular rhythms. So yeah, that's pretty cool. And then Baquiana Brasileira number 4 is the one for piano, written in 1942. It has 4 movements, and they have dual titles. So they have a European title and a Brazilian title, or Portuguese, I guess. So Preludio, introduction in Portuguese, Choral, and this is Song of the Jungle. Aria is song too, and Danza is Milinha is like a small little thing. It's like a piece. So he used harmonic procedures, textures, and contrapuntal devices from the time of Bach, together with the Brazilian rhythms. So this is the 4th movement. It has a toccata-like texture, and so the texture would be reminiscent of sort of like a, it's like Baroque in texture. But then of course the rhythms are quite syncopated, and like rhythmically it's very challenging actually. So so there's syncopation and there's hemiola. So even the 16-note pattern. So we're in 2/4, as you can see there. So the right hand, it's only 16 notes, but there's a sense of syncopation because of the displacement of the melody. So it's like kind of like playing with your expectations, right? So if I don't accent the strong beats, it could sound like a hemiola effect, right? So maybe I'll play it. I'll play it. It's a pretty cool piece. So here we go. that is Villalobos, Heitor Villalobos. So yeah, he has a lot of piano pieces that I would definitely recommend. This is kind of more advanced, but he has definitely easier pieces. There is a kind of famous piece for children. It's called Polichinello, which is the clown, and it's pretty doable for for younger pianists. So if you want to check that out, that's a great piece for students. And then finally, we get into Argentina with Alberto Ginastera. He is a very important composer, again, of course, in South America. And he had a difficult life in Argentina. He was an exponent of modernism as well, and his career could be divided into 3 different styles. So at the beginning, he actually divided his own career in these 3 different styles. So this is his own division, right? He thought that his first period would be the objective nationalism, and that is the period where he composed the 3 Argentinian dances that I will play for you. Then he had a subjective nationalism period, and finally neo-expressionism, which is very abstract, and it kind of followed a little bit of the 12th tone, theory of Arnold Schoenberg and the second pianist school. But then what happened is that in Argentina, there was another regime, but the style that he was composing was not really favorable for the regime, because it was considered like very abstract and complex for the large society. And for this reason, his pieces were censored. They were considered to be elitist and just not easily understandable for people. So yeah, he was actually banned in many cases. And for this reason, he was exiled and he moved to Switzerland. And the regime was Perón. Perón is the president, the president that kind of had this fight with him. In the US, he actually came to the US and studied with Aaron Copland in 1940s. And maybe, I guess you're familiar with Aaron Copland. He's a very important American composer in the 20th century. And again, his style, generally speaking, is kind of a mixture of European avant-garde with Argentinian folklore. But we need to understand a little bit of Argentinian folklore, right? So, as you probably know tango, right? That's probably the most famous genre in Argentinian music. But the thing is, he was not really interested in tango, but in rural genres of Argentinian music. And tango is a city type of music. So instead of getting inspired by tango, he was inspired by malambo, which is another genre of Argentinian music. In this case, it comes from the gaucho tradition. The gauchos are those archetypical countrymen from Argentina. They are like cowboys. You could think of them as cowboys, basically. And they have a very, strong personality, and they have, their own way of dressing and all of that. And one of the genres that they perform is called malambo, and that is a dance. As you can see, they dance with boots and with whips as well. So it's kind of a show-off dance, very virtuosic. It's only for men, actually, the malambo, no women in malambo. So the dance is accompanied generally by guitars. So that's kind of the instrumentation of the original malambo. And then for that reason, he kind of represented the guitar in his piano compositions. He was trying to imitate the sonorities of the guitar. He had the symbolic chord, which is the chord of the open strings of the guitar, and he called that the symbolic chord. It's a chord that goes like this. So those would be the 6 open strings of the guitar, and he kind of used that chord a lot, and he called it the symbolic chord. Yeah. So other features of like Argentinian folklore would be the octosyllabic melodies, because some of these songs are made out of octosyllabic verses. So for that reason, sometimes his melodies have like 8 notes. It's like you could add lyrics to the melody and it would have 8 syllables. The malambo is generally speaking in 6/8, But sometimes you have that ambivalence between 6/8 and 3/4. So 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3, that duality of 3/4 and 6/8. And then some of the European features in his music would be polytonality again, like we saw already in Lecuona. The use of non-functional parallel harmonies that comes from early 20th century. Without further ado, I will present the Danzas Argentinas. Those are 3 dances that he composed for piano, and this is his first piano composition from 1937, so this belongs to his period of objective nationalism. I misspelled this, it's Viejo Boyero. So the first one, Danza del Viejo Boyero with E here, sorry, E here, Viejo Boyero, which means dance of the old. Boyero is the person who takes care of cows, basically, yeah. So it's like dance of the old person, like the old cowboy, yeah, basically, yeah. And then dance of the generous lady, and dance of the. This is sort of like not a good person. Madrero means it's like someone who steals or someone who's like trying to like make a like cheat on you like in business, right? So it's like a cheater in that sense. So and gaucho is the Argentinian cowboy, yeah. So it's the cowboy that is like cheating on you, like trying to do something bad to you. So the second movement, this one will be the slow movement, and it has a melody with like 8 like octosyllabic melody, the one that I mentioned before. You will see guitar like accompaniment like this in the left hand. That texture, like that could be perfectly. That type of texture would be like very easy to transpose, like to perform in a guitar. It's like very natural for the instrument, and that's what he uses for the left hand. So the texture for the second dance would be sort of the texture you would get from a guitarist with a singer, or a guitarist with 2 singers, because there are two voices later on. And then, oh, this is cut for some reason. Let's see, second. Oh, sorry. Well, never mind. So yeah, I kind of had a. I guess it did not. I don't know. I guess when I like pasted the chart here, it did not show. But there are more than those rhythms. So that would be the 8-note pop 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 pop, just like one rhythmic pattern. But there's also a pum 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 or pop pum pum. There are like variants of that. Sorry, I didn't realize that was cut. But there are different patterns of malambo that are used throughout the third piece, especially. The third one would be mostly the one that is reminiscent of malambo. And the other last things that I wanted to mention are the polytonality here at the beginning of the first dance, and it's kind of the same thing that we saw already in Lecuona. We have black keys on the left, white keys on the right hand. So that polytonality again. The imitation of guitar strumming, the rasgueo, so it's like the type of accompanimental pattern of guitar in malambo. And the non-functional parallel harmonies, so on the right hand we have, so it's like parallel triads, no key, right? It's like non-functional, and that happens on the third movement. So, okay, let me see if there's anything else. I think that's everything I wanted to say. So yeah, I'll just play the 3 Argentinian dances by Ginastera. I think they have increasing difficulty in general. So maybe the first one is more doable, definitely, for younger pianists, and it becomes a little bit trickier as we advance. So here we go. That will be the first one. Then we have the slow one. It's very lyrical. presentation. And do you have any question? Like, yeah, if you have any question, please let me know. Yeah.
The name of the one, the first African dance by La Cuona, was that the? Can you remind me what the name of that was?
Yeah, la comparsa. La. In Spanish, you mean? Yeah, la. One word, la. Comparsa. C-O-M-P-A-R-S-E. Yes. Yeah. And by the way, another thing I forgot to mention. Many of these pieces that I presented today are actually copyright free, so you can actually get them for free at imslb.org. If you don't, they're accessible. Some of these composers died more than 75 years ago, like La Cuona, for instance. That is available for free online. The 6 Afro-Cuban dances, Villa Lobos, that's also accessible. Not the Argentinian dances, I don't think so. But yeah, Chiquinha Gonzaga definitely, and the 19th century composers for sure. So yeah, great resources to, yeah.
Are we going to say the choro?
The choro, yeah.
Okay. It made me think of ragtime.
Yes.
Yeah, there are.
Like, do you know which came first? Because I know that they're like right around the same
That's
time.
The thing, yeah. I don't think, I don't know, that's the honest
Sure,
question. I don't know what happened before, and sometimes it's kind of a coincidence, and it maybe not necessarily, because like the accompaniment patterns of Chiquinha Gonzaga kind of resemble the habanera sometimes, right?
Yeah.
The down, pop too. And I don't think she was doing that because of a Cuban influence necessarily. It's just, it's
just one of those
it's just
things.
those things that happen at the same time.
So
But
weird.
yeah,
Yeah.
maybe there's some connection that I really don't know about.
What year is that?
Which
that one right? When you talk about
The choros, well, that's from the late 19th century.
Okay.
So late 19th century, early 20th century. That's when, yeah. Yeah. Any other question? Well, thank you so much for coming, guys. Enjoyed it. Thank you.